the radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the Yaron Brook Show. Thanks for joining me on this Friday evening. Good Friday again. Good beginning of the weekend. So, all right. So I think many of you know I did a debate. Well, it wasn't really a debate. It wasn't meant to be a debate. Maybe it turned into a debate. But I did an event at Clemson University a couple of nights ago on Western civilization with Andrew Sullivan, the conservative intellectual. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to expand on my discussion of what I said during this conversation or this debate that we had. So I want to dig a little deeper, if you will, into what Western civilization is and who constitutes the enemies of Western civilization, and what civilization is. I think that's important. So at Clemson 2 nights ago, Andrew Sullivan and I, and it was very much presented. Andrew did not want to do a debate, so and I think Brad Thompson, the head of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, an institute that I'm on the board of advisors of, and that I've been supportive of from its very beginning, I would say. The idea was to have a conversation. The idea was to have a conversation about Western civilization, what it was, and whether it was worth saving. And Andrew Sullivan, for those of you who don't know him, you'll see him in the video if you watch it. I put it up last night or yesterday. Andrew Sullivan is a well-known conservative intellectual. He is a regular writer in New York Magazine. I have often cited him on this show. I'd actually cited him on this show. One of the topics which I give Andrew a lot of credit for, basically my understanding of, is the whole issue of intersectionality on the left. He's a real critic of that. He's written a couple of really, really good articles on intersectionality. One was called "Is Intersectionality a Religion?", which I covered in a podcast in 2017. Really, it was my first exposure to the whole issue of intersectionality and what it was, and what the problems of it were. And I thought I learned a lot from Sullivan's article on that one. And then in November of 2019, he had a piece called "The Intersectionality Left's Political Endgame." And again, I thought it was really good, and I think I actually used that piece as well when I talked about intersectionality late last year. So Andrew's very good. He's a good writer. I recommend reading him. His writing is sharp. It's good. It's very effective. He is on many issues. He's a very good thinker. I guess I didn't realize going into. I knew he was a Catholic. He's also gay. He is. So he went through the whole AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and had that experience, and he is he's very thoughtful, I always thought. He is a real critic of Trump in a way that I am very sympathetic to. That is, we agree. The thing I think we agreed on most during this conversation was our criticism of Trump. So anyway, I thought he was a really, he's a really interesting intellectual. I guess didn't realize just how Catholic he was, and the extent to which Catholicism plays a role in his intellectual thought, because it doesn't necessarily come across in his writing. There's always a tinge of it in what I read. Now, I haven't read everything by him, obviously. I think there's a tinge of it, but it's. I didn't know it dominated his thought the way it came across in the discussion in the discussion the other day. So I thought that was really interesting. You'll get to see, if you watch this, and I encourage you again to watch it. It's on my channel. It is you get to see a thoughtful, for the most part, rational person, completely, I think, ultimately corrupted by his religion, and therefore not being able to really be consistent. And you can see what religion does, in a sense, to a mind, and what a dedication to the religion does to one's thinking. It becomes a real, a real issue. There was a point in which my attack on religion got him to the point of where he said, "Screw you, Yaron," because I said, "We don't need religion. Let's get rid of it." And he takes it. He said he grew up with religion and it's part of him, and there's no him without religion. So anyway, I encourage everybody to watch it. It's really, I think, interesting, and the exchange is interesting, and I think I do a decent job. And I think others, right? And I think that I think it's interesting to watch how conservatives, even the more moderate conservatives, they're not nationalist conservatives, deal with. He's certainly anti-capitalist conservative. I didn't realize how anti-capitalist, how environmentalist he was. And again, I've for years said that religion and environmentalism are going to get together, that is the future. And he is a good example of that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Western civilization. What is Western civilization? So first is, what is civilization? I mean, civilization is a culture, a geographic area in which significant achievements are made, at least relative to what is going on for the rest of mankind. So a civilization is a place where real achievements are being achieved in comparison to everything going on around them, right? So we can talk about a Mesopotamian civilization, ancient civilization, because, this is where I think, correct me if my history's wrong, writing and farming and other aspects, other achievements, law, first examples of a legal system we can find in Mesopotamia, right? Egypt is a civilization because it achieves certain things technologically. We might say it's limiting. That is, that the civilization is limited, the achievements are limited, but it is a civilization. Of course, Greek civilization is maybe the epitome of an example of this, because it surpasses Egyptian, it surpasses the Mesopotamian. It becomes the leading civilization in that the achievements of the Greeks, whether in art, in philosophy, in thinking, in science, in politics, in almost every realm of human endeavor, exceed anything else that the world has seen. Rome is definitely a civilization, and there's very little competition. There's civilization in China. Again, there are achievements being achieved in China during certain eras. So, civilization is the sum of an achievements of a particular people, culture, area, geographic area. And Western civilization is the achievements of the peoples primarily identified by Western Europe and the United States, although, so Western Europe and some of the areas that were colonized by Western Europe, although, as we'll see, I think what makes Western civilization unique is that because it is a civilization that is fundamentally based on ideas, it is not limited by geography, it is not limited to a people, it is not limited to a place, but it is something that can transverse that place. It can go beyond that place. It can go, in a sense, you can you can have Western civilization in any geographic area by any people in any place in the world. It doesn't have to be in the West. It doesn't have to be Europeans. It can be anybody. So what is Western civilization? What are these achievements? Well, if we look at the achievements, well, first, when does Western civilization happen? I mean, there is no Western civilization before the Renaissance. There are some centers of learning. There's stuff going on. There's some innovation in business, but there's very little. Life is horrific. There's very little achievement qua human beings during the period before the Renaissance in Europe. Indeed, there's much more achievement, science, scientific achievement, literary achievement, philosophical achievement, scientific achievement going on in the East, in the Muslim world, in the, certainly from the 900s, 800s, 900s through the 1200s, particularly if you include Spain in that. So there is no Western civilization. One wouldn't consider the West civilized before the Renaissance. There was Islamic civilization, and there was barbarism. And the West the Christian West during this period was clearly part of a barbarism. Now, out of this barbarism arose a civilization, primarily with the beginnings of the Renaissance. That civilization manifested itself during the Renaissance in primarily art, the beginnings of science, the beginnings of philosophy, particularly towards the end of the Renaissance and into the Baroque period. There is real beginnings of real philosophical innovation. Certainly art goes through the roof, the innovations of art. But that is all a product of, the 15th century and on. There is no Western civilization before that. The same people live in the West. To some extent, the same political authorities are in the West. But there's nothing civilized about it. There are no great achievements. And one of the things Sullivan mentions is this grand cathedral that I don't have the dates on when it was built, but my guess is it was built before the Renaissance. And I don't consider that an achievement. And I don't consider that enough to qualify civilization. Civilization requires more than a building, particularly more than a building whose only purpose is a glory to God. In other words, and is built on the backs of the poor peasantry, the poor workers of the time. It much more to me is like the pyramids, which, yes, you could say a symbol of Egyptian civilization, not a good civilization in particular. And Egypt, if they'd only built the pyramids, we wouldn't be that impressed. It's everything else that they did. And again, not a particularly good civilization. A pretty primitive civilization. A pretty backward civilization. As compared to what comes immediately afterwards, which is Greece. So the real achievements of the West, the real civilizational achievements, the cultural achievements only start from the Renaissance on. And then primarily in the arts, then slowly into science, and ultimately into every aspect of human life. Now, what marks Western civilization is in a sense a connection to the Greeks and a connection to a particular view that Greece had of mankind. So, if you look at the art of the Renaissance is clearly heavily influenced by Greek art, by what they knew of Greek art. And what does Greek art express? Well, it expresses a certain view of man, a certain view of human beings. It is a view that human beings are heroic, capable, competent, able, efficacious in this world. It is a this worldly view that you can see in Michelangelo's David, which I talked about in the debate and I've talked about many times on the show. But you can see it in Michelangelo's Pietà, which is a religious topic, subject, but a secular theme, mother and a son who's died. But the son is heroic, the son is magnificent. And the mother, sad and proud, devastated and proud of her son. It's so touching, it's so moving, it's so emotional, it's so powerful. But each figure, the mother, Mary, and Jesus, are individuals with individual characteristics, individual facial expressions, individual bodies. Jesus is a Greek god, a heroic body of a god. And you see this in the Renaissance, even when they paint religious themes. The people are individuals. The people have emotions. The people have character. As compared, for example, to the pre-Renaissance art, which is flat. No emotion, no character. Everybody looks the same. There's no distinction. There's no heroism. There's no efficaciousness. There's just people, usually in very religious poses, flat, unmoving, unengaged. So there's a massive shift in Western culture from pre-Renaissance to Renaissance. And what characterizes it is primarily viewing the individual as worthwhile. And this is the idea they get from the Greeks. They get it from Greek art, and they get it from Greek philosophy. Even Greek philosophy, we would maybe disagree with, let's say Plato, has an enormous respect for the individual and for the human mind and for the individual's pursuit of happiness. So we have a culture, a civilization emerging during the Renaissance with an implicit, because it's in the art, it's not necessarily anywhere else, it's in the art, respect for the individual, an implicit respect for happiness, an implicit respect for reason, still implicit, not philosophical, but certainly there. You know, I've recommended this before, but I'll recommend it again. Walter Isaacson's book on Leonardo da Vinci is fabulous, partially because it brings out the fact that, you know, Leonardo da Vinci was this amazing scientist, innovator, engineer, but scientist, and that he was respected as such. That there was a respect for his outlandish character. He was quite something in terms of his just behavior and character. And for his mind, a massive respect for his mind, for his scientific mind, for his mathematical mind, for his engineering mind. That's new. Nobody cared 200 years earlier. There's a good chance he would have been burnt at the stake 200 years earlier. So, Western civilization is born out of certain ideas that they accept from the Greeks. And it's born more implicitly than explicitly. It's born in the art before it's born in the philosophy. Because the art is a consequence of philosophy they are reading from Greece. The Plato, the Aristotle. Aristotle more than anything. And this respect for the individual and respect for reason is manifest now in the sculpture, in the painting of the era. And this is a period where you also get, Andrew Sullivan mentioned Shakespeare, but you also get Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, again, is philosophically terrible. Right? And this is the problem, that the implicit ideas can be recreated in the sculpture and the paintings, but when it comes to literature, they don't have the philosophical grounding in order to manifest them. So again, they remain implicit. But in Shakespeare, these ideas are implicit in his characterization, in his interesting characters, in his understanding of evil, his understanding of the choices people make. There's a certain determinism in Shakespeare. There's a big chunk of determinism in Shakespeare, just like there is in Greek plays. But you can see there are larger-than-life characters for good and evil. And there is a beautiful language in the service of all this. So clearly a massive achievement. I mean, the plays of Shakespeare are some of the greatest achievements of world literature. And it's no accident that they come during this period. The Renaissance, late Renaissance, into the Baroque. So, but from the beginning, Western civilization is about the individual. And it's only in the Enlightenment, and in a sense even of Reformation, if you will, is an expression of this. It's a rebellion against authority, at least worldly authority. It's a rebellion within the religion saying, within Christianity saying, but I can have an individual connection to God. I don't need the Pope. I don't need the hierarchy. I don't need the priests. I can communicate with God directly. Now that is a huge step forward. Now, Protestantism is very problematic from lots of other respects. But the idea of the individual's, in a sense, responsibility for his own religion is a powerful one. And then, of course, we get the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment puts, in a sense, at least attempts to put philosophy to this spirit. The idea of individual rights, which formalizes the idea of individualism politically, and hints of a morality and the idea of the pursuit of happiness and the virtue of the pursuit of happiness. The idea of reason, the efficaciousness of reason, the importance of reason, the idea that knowledge comes from reason. All of these are achievements of the Enlightenment, and that Enlightenment is what makes possible the Declaration of Independence. It makes possible America, and it makes possible the Industrial Revolution, which politically and economically are the great achievements of Western civilization. Western civilization is the greatest civilization, because it has the greatest achievements in human history. Whether it's artistic achievements, from the sculpture, painting of the early Renaissance through Michelangelo, through Leonardo and Raphael, through Bernini, through the Baroque, into the 18th century and 19th century, and the 19th century sculpture and painting and literature, to Hugo, and ultimately the architecture, as I mentioned on the show, of Frank Lloyd Wright. All of that emphasizing individualism, the individual, at kind of an emotional, preconceptual level. And so all of that, and then through all that is the second thread. It was the respect for reason, the idea of the importance of science. Again, going from Leonardo to Galileo, to Copernicus, Kepler, to Newton, and the whole scientific revolution that follows. That's Western civilization. And that leads to a politics, a certain political creation. The respect for the individual, the respect for the human mind, leads to the Declaration of Independence, which unleashes political freedom upon the world and brings us the Industrial Revolution. So artistically, the greatest achievements ever, right? From the Renaissance through the 19th century, in music, in literature, and sculpture, and painting, and everything. Politically, the greatest achievement was the creation of the United States of America. economically and politically, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution are its great achievements. That is what Western civilization is. It is that respect for the individual and for reason and everything that produces, which is all the wealth we have in the world today, spiritual and material. Yet today, Western civilization is under attack. It's under attack with the idea from all kinds of directions. The egalitarians hate it because they say there's nothing better than anything else. Well, and even Andrew Sullivan, to some extent, suggested during our debate that, well, life kind of sucks today. Hunter-gatherers maybe had it better. They lived longer, healthier, happier lives. Really? Really? That all the technology and the wealth and success that we've had only brings problems, no benefits. Really? So there's this idea that, no, all cultures are the same. All cultures are equal. Cultures that promote human life, cultures that develop the spirit, that make us rich, that provide us with technology, that provide us with medicine, that provide us with all these things. They equal to cultures that abuse women, that engage in female genital mutilation, that engage in women not being able to drive and not being able to own property, or cultures where people still go out and gather food, that have no surplus, that live in huts. All of those are the same. There's no difference. So there's this egalitarian perspective, and we'll talk about in a minute where that comes from. Right? But there's also those who would say, to some extent, Andrew, yeah, Western civilization is too material, and where is that deep religiosity that was so wonderful during the Dark Ages? And there's a religionist attack today on Western civilization. We've taken it too far. We saw that when I talked about some of the debates within the conservative movement, primarily out of the Catholics, the first things, that say there's too much individualism today in the West. There's too much respect for the individual. Then there's the left criticism. Western civilization was built in slavery. There's the whole 1619 project out of the New York Times, which I'll have to do a show on, but everything was built on slavery and colonialism. The West did nothing, achieved nothing, produced nothing that is not on the backs of Native Americans, blacks, Indians from India, colonialism, and so on. And of course, the attacks are much deeper than that. We have attacks on the two foundational elements of Western civilization. And these are the two enemies. The real enemies of Western civilization are those who reject reason and those who reject individualism and the individual's moral right to pursue his own happiness. And they come in the form of mystics who attack reason, mystics who could be religious. So there's a growing movement today to present the Dark Ages as nice. Oh, huge achievements. Christian civilization. Wonderful, just as good as the Renaissance. Renaissance is not a change. So there's the religious element, and you're seeing that, again, rise up today, I think, primarily on the right. But then you see the secular religions. And what makes the religions is their rejection of reason. And it was interesting that Andrew Sullivan actually recognized that these were secular religions. Communism, fascism, really all forms of tribalism, intersectionality, much of what the left preaches today, much of what the nutty left preaches today is religion in the sense that it is not backed by argument, it is not backed by reason, it is not backed by logic. And just like a religion, it typically is, like environmentalism is a good example. There's original sin, there's commandments, there's a God, there's sacrifice. So any attack of reason, against reason, whether it comes in the form of Marx or Hegel, or comes in the form of intersectionality feminism, or critical racial theory, or whatever it's called, or whether it comes in the form of white supremacists. All of those are fundamentally anti-Western civilization. All of those reject a fundamental premise, cause, foundation of what Western civilization relies on and is based on. Somebody says the volume is low. Is your volume low? If anybody can indicate. For some reason, I don't have a chat on Facebook, but on YouTube it's fluctuating only because I move in and out and I yell and then stop yelling and stuff like that. But is the volume low? I don't. Volume is. I think it's. I mean, the settings are the same. It should be good. Okay, the volume's fine. Everybody says. So the enemy is the enemy. The enemy is the enemy in reason. It always has been. So in that sense, I believe Christianity is anti-Western civilization. It's an enemy of Western civilization in that it rejects the application of reason to all human issues. I think communism is not, as many people consider like communism, oh, that's the bad part of Western civilization. No, that is the forces that are always around in our culture that hate Western civilization, that rejects Western civilization, fighting against it. Fascism, tribalism, white supremacism, the radical left. These are all anti-Western forces. And in that sense, Western civilization has always had inside of it, at its core, among its people, these ideas, the anti-Western ideas, have always been present. Primarily religion. As Michelangelo is sculpting the David, he is also he becomes more and more deeply religious as he gets older, but he is religious. He has within him the ideas that destroy David, that destroy the ability of anybody to produce a David, of anybody to enjoy a David, of anybody to appreciate a David, or understand a David. And indeed, I think real Christians, when they look at David, yeah, they can, relates to some biblical hero or something, but they don't get the profound metaphysical meaning of the sculpture. And their enjoyment of it is limited. I think that's true of anybody who does not believe human beings are heroic and have heroic potential. So, the enemies of Western civilization are always being amongst us and being a part of the heroes of Western civilization. You've got the great scientists who are also very religious. You've got some of the founding fathers who are also very religious. On the one hand, writing that you have an inalienable right to pursuit of happiness, and on the other hand, justifying altruism in its Christian sense. So, communism, fascism, all the mystical forces, ideas, people out there, even though geographically they're in our midst, they're in the West, they're surrounded by civilization, and to some extent they might even be contributing to that civilization. To the extent that they take those ideas seriously, to that extent they are the enemies of civilization. The enemies of civilization. So, of course, that's at the level of reason. The same thing goes for individualism. To the extent that we revert to tribalism, to the respect that we respect tribalism, to the extent that there are tribes among us and people among us who push for tribalism of whatever sort, of the intersectionality sort, of the what's it called, racial identity sort of the left, or of the white supremacist sort of the right. To the extent that people are tribal, they are anti-Western. They are rejecting the fundamental premise of Western civilization. To the extent that they play nation above self, tribe among self, collective above self, race above self, ethnic group above self. They are rejecting the very heart, the very idea of Western civilization. So the enemies of Western civilization amongst us are anybody who holds tribal and mystical ideas. And one of the reasons we are seeing our civilization in decline is because many people around us, left and right, hold ideas that undercut, that are fundamentally anti the West. And this goes back to a theme I in a sense, keep returning to, which is that our job is to save the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment is the philosophical foundation of Western civilization. It's not to teach every Western thinker who ever lived. It's not to embrace every Western artist, so-called artist who ever lived. Kandinsky is not an artist. He doesn't contribute. He's not contributed to Western civilization. It's that we need to identify the core ideas, the core products, the core creations of the West. And that is what we should celebrate and teach. And philosophically and politically, it's the Enlightenment. And then we need to improve on it because the Enlightenment is being attacked consistently from Kant to Rousseau, from Rousseau to Kant, and to Hegel, to Schopenhauer, to Marx, to Nietzsche. The Enlightenment is under massive attack. And it is only Ayn Rand who stands in defense of the Enlightenment. It is only Ayn Rand who stands in defense of Western civilization. So if you care about Western civilization, if you get a sense that there's something good here, that there's something worth preserving here, that there's something important here, that what needs to be defended, what needs to be promoted, what needs to be brought into the world are the ideas of Ayn Rand. The ideas of Ayn Rand, the great art of the Renaissance through the 19th century, and the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. That is what it's going to take to defend Western civilization. No shortcuts. And indeed, part of that defense is going to mean a rejection of religion, a rejection of communism, a rejection of race as meaningful, as having any meaning, as contributing anything to civilization. Okay, that's my spiel. There's a lot to talk about here, but let me see. There's some questions relating to this. I'm going to skip those. Would you say the discussion was a classic example of Aristotle versus Plato? You both even mentioned those names, even asked about fundamental philosophy. There's a sense in which it was, but look, that would be unbelievably pretentious of me to argue that I was Aristotle and he was Plato. Neither of us are geniuses. Neither of us are, once in in all of the human race's kind of giants. Aristotle and Plato are the greatest thinkers, greatest giants of all time. So it would be super pretentious. But to the extent that I was trying to represent an Aristotelian view of the world, and he was definitely, and acknowledge it, presenting a Platonic view of the world, then yes, you could see it as a reflection of what those ideas would look like, what those ideas in a modern time by people who are not Aristotle and Plato, obviously, looks like. I was advocating reason. He was advocating some reason, but a lot of, mysticism, maybe in a Platonic sense of some kind of revelation, of some knowledge that is beyond us, of some kind of philosopher king. He definitely wanted a philosopher king. He wants to control economic growth. He wants to control immigration. He wants to control things based on what? On some common good, he said. Who gets to decide what that common good is? Well, you need a philosopher king for that. Because mere mortals, how would they decide this? So there's a sense in which you could see it was a debate between an Aristotelian and a Platonist. But again, I wouldn't make it Plato versus Aristotle. It's way, way too ambitious. Okay, why do religionists like Sullivan glorify community? Well, because by elevating God above us, we as individuals are nothing. God can't care that much about you as an individual. He might, for whatever reason, care about the human race. He might care about a community. But your purpose in life, your function in life, is God. And you are just one person, and the only way to really, how do you build one of those cathedrals? Well, everybody needs to be sacrificed. Thousands, tens of thousands of people need to be sacrificed. Community needs to be sacrificed for the sake of that cathedral. So there's something above you, the community, and then there's something about the community, which is God. What God does as well is he basically, it eviscerates your confidence in your reason. Reason is ephemeral, he would say. It's not permanent. It's just you. Whereas religion is forever, and it's true in some way that reason can't really get to. It's deep. It's more important. And therefore, whatever you do with reason, it's debatable. But religious truths, those are real, foundational. Well, if you can't really trust your thinking to get a really true and foundational, you undercut your reason. You elevate, in a sense, emotion. Then what else do you have but a community, a tribe to guide you? You as an individual are not competent to set your life. You as an individual cannot use reason to completely determine your life. I mean, you saw even in the debate, those people in the Midwest, why should they get up and think for themselves? I expect too much of people. Well, if people cannot think for themselves, then they're ultimately dependent on other people. They're ultimately dependent on the community. And if you can't think for yourself, if you can't reason for yourself, then what is left but to be embraced by and to become dependent on the community? So any version of giving up on reason will ultimately lead to the importance of community, the importance of society. Because if you give up on reason, you give up on the individual. If you give up on the mind, you give up on the ability of the individual to survive, to thrive, to be successful. So what's he got left? Rely on the experts and go with the group. All right. Would you say Andrew Sullivan represents some form of medieval mystic? That is one of the impressions I'd gotten from watching the video. You did an excellent job, by the way, thanks. No, I don't think he's quite that bad. No. I mean, he's clearly struggling. He is, he told me he grew up with Catholicism. It's part of who he is. It's part of what he is. But, he's gay. A medieval mystic couldn't be gay and not accept it. He does not accept religion as dogma in that sense. Otherwise, how could he be gay and embrace that? He opposes much of the kind of doctrinal Catholicism. So again, I don't think he's a medieval in that sense where it's dogma and that's all that matters. He wants to interpret Catholicism in his own way, and he has his own way of interpreting it. We didn't get into details of it, but he definitely has his own way. He's a very thoughtful political scientist. He studied political science with the best conservative minds out there, but this is what it looks like. But no, I think at the end of the day, he has some respect for modernity and capitalism and science and technology, but he can't go all in on it. He can't go all in on it. So he tends to go against it, particularly when he's got me as a contrast. But you could see Andrew Sullivan debating a socialist and defending capitalism and defending technology. Up to a point, of course. Not completely, not fully, not laissez-faire. But in comparison to the socialist. And using reason and facts rather than citing the Old Testament to do it. So no, I don't think of him that way. I think he's very confused. I think religion is this massive burden. He thinks it liberates him. I think it's a massive burden on him. I think it shrinks his mind. I think he's incredibly smart, incredibly knowledgeable, who is being shrunk, limited, constrained, put in a very difficult cognitive situation by his Catholicism. He can't fully think things through. I think this whole idea of we're destroying the planet, we're destroying the animals, I mean, that is so consistent with a Christian point of view, a point of view that says we are sinners, a point of view that says we are guardians of this earth. This all belongs to God. There's no Mother Earth, but there is God, and Earth is His creation, and therefore we need to take care of it. But all right, not a medieval mystic, a modern one. Will the West slowly crawl out of this ditch and absorb objectivism over the next 100 years, or is the descent into fascism unstoppable at this point? Well, crawling out of the ditch might involve a period of fascism. That is, we had a period of fascism in the 20th century, not in the United States, but around the world. But even in the United States, eugenics was big in the US. And we crawled out of that. So I do think it's going to take 100 years of crawling out of where we are, or maybe digging us deeper and then crawling out. But I think 50 to 100 years is the right time frame to think about this. And I think as long as we speak, as long as we read, as long as we promote the books, as long as we get Ayn Rand's ideas out there, there is always a chance that crawl becomes a faster crawl or a walk or ultimately a run. So this free will exists. People can change their minds. And our job is to talk and to talk and to talk and to write and share and like and things like that, right? Use social media and whatever other mechanisms you have to get your views out there, and most importantly of all, to get people to read Ayn Rand. Right? So I think that is crucial if we're going to crawl out of this. Is Sullivan a good example of the mystic right leading to anti-capitalism, just like the mysticism of the left does? Yes. I think this is an example of mystic right leading to anti-capitalism and environmentalism. And I have a talk, unfortunately there's no video or audio of it, that I gave once. I need to find the written version of it, because there was a talk that I'd actually written out, where I basically predict that ultimately the religious right and the left, the environmentalist left, will merge. And that they share fundamental anti-capitalism. And I've talked about this over and over again with you guys. So more or less convinced some of you and not others, but that the right, the religious right in particular, and the intellectual religious right in particular, is ever more anti-capitalist. Ever more anti-capitalist. And Sullivan is a good example of that. And you have to be, because what does capitalism rest on? It rests on what Western civilization rests on. It rests on efficacy of the mind, and therefore freedom of the mind, freedom of the individual to pursue his own values and to keep the rewards of his own labor. Capitalism is the right to life. But the right to life means freedom. Why should you have freedom? Because you're rational and because you want to pursue your happiness. Freedom is not obvious. Most people don't want freedom. Most philosophers don't want you to have freedom. Because freedom requires a morality that is based on reason and happiness. The reason to have freedom is so you can use your mind free of coercion in pursuit of your happiness. If it was just to use your mind without the pursuit of happiness, why would you care about using your mind? Happiness is the goal. If it was just about using happiness without reason, it would be like hedonism, and then you'd want force in order to control people for doing really, really stupid things. The whole point of freedom is about using your mind in pursuit of your happiness. That's why we want freedom. Again, this is why libertarianism and libertarians, libertarianism is so flawed, because it doesn't get the purpose of freedom. So they have a non-initiation of force principle, supposedly. It's not a principle. But for what purpose? It's only for the purpose of living your life based on your reason in pursuit of your values for the purpose of your happiness. Okay. Sullivan's utopian ideal of the community that he expressed, the unchanging town with a baker, was reminiscent of the purest vision of Germany, sons, Jews, and Nazi propaganda. Is that a reach? Well, I mean, it's a reach in a sense that he would obviously say that's not true, but it harkens back to German conservatives of the 19th century who were horrified by capitalism, by the changes it brought, by the changes in culture, by the changes in sexual norms, by the liberation of women, by the liberation of slaves in the South. It's yes, conservatism has always hated capitalism because capitalism moves fast. Capitalism unleashes forces they cannot control. Capitalism liberates slaves. Capitalism ultimately destroys colonies. Destroys colonialism, not destroys colonies, destroys colonialism. Capitalism ultimately liberates women. It's only capitalist countries that these things happen to. Rome had no internal mechanism to get rid of its colonies. Capitalism does. It's called the self-interest of people. Freedom. The ideas that are at the heart of capitalism are contrary to the idea of colonialism. They're contrary to the idea of slavery. And they're contrary to the idea of marginalizing women. And that's why capitalism is the only system in human history that liberated slaves, that gave women equal rights, and it ultimately got rid of colonies. But that's change that many conservatives can't handle. It's fast, it's quick, it happens quickly. I mean, the founding fathers were not conservatives, they were radicals. The 19th century was not a conservative era, it was a radical change era. Burke, who acknowledges that change will come, but he wants it slow, and he wants it moderated, and he wants it controlled. That's not capitalism, that's not freedom. Freedom, you can't control the change. Freedom, you don't moderate the change. The change just happens. That's what freedom means. So, conservatives in general viewed it this way, and yes, Nazi ideology had those elements in it. They wanted the German folk to be living in German villages with German people doing German things the way they did them for 1,000 years. Capitalism in the end was anathema to the Germans. The idea that fascism is an extension of capitalism in some way is bizarre. It's the exact opposite. Fascism is the rejection of capitalism, the rejection of the freedom and individualism implicit in capitalism. All right. Do you have an opinion on the role of secret societies during the Enlightenment era into the French Revolution? The Masons, the Illuminati, etc. Now, I don't know much about this. Very little, actually, maybe nothing. I'll say this as a a speculation, so take it for what it's worth. In an era where there wasn't free speech, the church controlled everything, and this is particularly true coming out of the Renaissance, where there were limits on free speech, where there was an authority, where there was a king, where there was a church that controlled you. If you were promoting ideas, you had to do it in secret. You had to do it in private. And I think a lot of these clubs, a lot of these secret societies were formed as a way to engage with ideas. For example, if you were caught, there was a period, if you were caught with Spinoza's books, you would be tried for heresy and for all kinds of things. Right? They were illegal. They were banned. But there were little secret groups that used to meet in secret and read the books and study them and discuss them. Now, I don't know if that's the Masons or the Illuminati, but secrecy is necessary when you don't have freedom, particularly when you don't have freedom of speech. All right. Is Western civilization becoming like ancient Rome in elevating the purely physical, concrete-bound, short-term mentality over reason? Yes. I mean, Western civilization has many things that parallel Rome. And, of course, Rome falls as it becomes more Christian. But, yes, I think the nihilism and the hedonism, the concrete-bound, the physicality, the rejection of kind of Aristotelian reason, all were undercut the Roman Empire and undercutting our own culture today, our own civilization today. So yes, there's probably many parallels. Welfare state. There are probably many parallels between the decline of Rome and the decline that we are going to be witnessing in the West today. All right, let me see. Okay, let's do some of these that are not related to the topic. Okay, any plans on making a show dedicated to Jack Walsh? Yes, if I do a show tomorrow, I'll probably dedicate it to Jack Walsh, or at least do a section on Jack Walsh. Jack Walsh was one of my heroes. He died about 10 days ago, I think, and he was certainly one of the great heroes of American capitalism of the last 50 to 100 years. And one of the amazing things about Walsh is that since he's died, the hate that is being spewed against him in the media is stunning, and somebody has to defend him, and that'll be my job in the show that I do, I'll try to do tomorrow. Let's see. Okay, from Jonathan, big banks are in a bear market. Thoughts? Wow, bear market is a nice way to put it. Bank stocks have just been crushed. Now I don't follow big banks, so I don't know how badly the big banks have done. But little banks, I can tell you, banks more broadly, there's an index called the KRE, which is an index of bank stocks. The KRE is down 25% for the year. 25% in 2 months and a week. That is a lot. That is more than a bear market. That is truly, really crushing. So my thoughts are that banks, the market's view is, the banks are highly susceptible to a recession. I think banks are priced as if there is going to be a recession. I don't know if there is going to be a recession, but banks are priced as if there is going to be one. The banks are also very susceptible, true, to negative interest rates. Negative interest rates are massive problems for banks. And to the extent that interest rates are flat, zero, big problem for banks. Because if you think about banks, they borrow cheap. They borrow short-term, and they lend out long-term and at higher rates. And if the yield curve is flat, if rates across the entire, if everything is zero, then they have a hard time lending at rates where they can make a profit. At least that's the perception. I think everybody's also afraid of a 2008-like banking environment where banks go bankrupt en masse, where there are massive failures and collapses of big and small banks. Now, I'm not going to comment here on the big banks because I don't really have an opinion about the big banks. I don't understand them. They are, to some extent, black boxes. It's hard to analyze exactly what they do and how much risk they carry and what exactly is going on there. But I can tell you about smaller banks that it's not going to be 2008. Small banks are well capitalized, they're liquid, and they're cheap. So I think the parallels are wrong. I suspect that the market is overreacting when it comes to banks, but I'd rather, this is not an investment show. I'm not allowed to do an investment show, and I certainly can't give you advice about what to investing. So my general sense right now is there's still a lot of downward. If there is a recession, if the recession is coming, then I think there's a lot more down potential for the S&P. I think banks are being already priced as if a recession is here. So the pricing pressure on banks is far greater than the pricing pressure has been on non-bank companies. So, I mean, the S&P, the NASDAQ, the NYC have now gone down anywhere close to 25%. All right. All right, there's one. Okay, why do objectivists believe in a new dark ages? Well, I don't know. We believe in a new dark ages. We believe that bad philosophy leads to bad ideas. Bad philosophy leads to bad ideas. And bad philosophy leads to bad outcomes. Bad ideas manifest themselves in reality in bad stuff happening, bad economics, bad politics, authoritarianism, and a bad culture. And if you believe that the ideas that the world has today, that people in the world have today are bad and turning away from freedom and liberty and capitalism and reason and individualism, then there's going to be a negative outcome. And that negative outcome, it's hard to see how it manifests itself. One possibility is the Dark Ages. Now, I tend to think that is going to be really hard. And part of the problem, part of the difference between now and Rome is that in Rome, knowledge was very concentrated. Very few people had knowledge. Very few people had information. Very few people had books. In the world, in the entire world, very few people had knowledge. I think the fundamental difference between now and then is that today, billions of people have access to knowledge. They can read. They have books. So while America might be in decline, who knows what country out there might be on the rise? Who knows what individuals and where there might be a renaissance? There might be an enlightenment. So I think we're in much better shape than Rome was because of globalization, and not globalization just of trade, but globalization of knowledge, of information. There are universities all over the world. There are engineers all over the world. When Rome fell, all engineering knowledge was lost. Most people couldn't read. The knowledge of how to make sculptures disappeared. The knowledge of how to pipe water into cities had disappeared. The engineering knowledge. And of course, the philosophical knowledge. The books were burnt. The books went away. The books were put in libraries that nobody read. They were in monasteries that nobody looked at. I think the fact that today we've got, 8 billion people on planet Earth, maybe 5 billion of them have the capacity, can certainly read, have access to libraries, have access to an internet, have access to information, to knowledge. There are millions and millions of engineers. There are millions of scientists. There are lots of educated people. To see all of that go away in every country, in every corner of the planet Earth, I just don't see that happening. I just don't see it. So I think we're in for tough times. I think we could be in certain parts of the world for fascism. I think we're in for certain parts of the world for authoritarianism and decay and decline. But I just don't see a true dark ages that is global. There's too many opportunities for light to still shine somewhere. by some people. Knowledge would not be lost in the same way that it was lost after the fall of Rome. That is my, if you're interested in that, I have a talk called Rational Optimism, and you can find it on my channel. Just do Yaron Brook, Rational Optimism. And I gave a talk on why I am still somewhat, moderately optimistic. In some emergencies, don't you have to be second-hander? If you're having a heart attack and you're in the ER, you can't question the doctor to make sure you're okay with the procedure. That is true, but that doesn't make you a second-hander. A second-hander assumes you have a choice. You can't get moral blame when you don't have a choice. But, you know, to the extent that you're conscious, you can ask, what hospital am I in? To the extent that you can ask to let your primary care physician let him know. To the extent that you've planned it right, he would then recommend the best physician to take care of you in the hospital. So being a second-hander does not mean that in every circumstances you make all the decisions. Well, you can't. And sometimes you physically can't. You're restricted. It means that when you have a choice, you count on your mind. Even counting on your mind by deciding that you're going to let the doctor do what the doctor has to do in order to cure you. And you're not going to intervene. That's what first-handed means. It means applying your mind, your independent judgment, when you can. Sometimes you can't. Like, you've just had a heart attack. You're on the stretcher. You can't make decisions. Nobody's going to pay attention to you anyway. So, yeah, you're not a second-hander then. Paperback or ebook to read and think on Ayn Rand's works? That's completely up to you. Completely up to you. Somebody, Lewis here, just came on and yelled at me and swore at me and then said, "Free my country, Puerto Rico." I live in Puerto Rico. I'm a Puerto Rican like you. Well, I'm a new immigrant to Puerto Rico. You probably don't want me. But if Puerto Rico became independent, would it be freer than Puerto Rico under the United States of America? I hope that's right, but I'm not sure it is. So, I mean, it's not clear to me that you would be freer as a state or freer as a free country, because freedom is not a function of your tribe gets to choose your leader. Freedom is a function of your ability as an individual to live your life based on your judgment in pursuit of your happiness. And then the question is, under which political regime is that more possible? Under a independent Puerto Rico or under an American Puerto Rico? And it's not obvious to me what the answer is to that. And the more I live in Puerto Rico, the less I'm confident that your politicians here would do a better job in securing freedoms for Puerto Ricans than the Americans do. And a confederation of Caribbean states would be an unmitigated disaster. There's not a single Caribbean state that has true political freedom in it. And, I mean, I wish there was. I'd be advocate for that. I'd love to be able to leave the United States and create a country that's even more free than the U.S. I'm just not convinced that the Caribbeans have the ideas, have the political philosophy, have the motivation to actually bring about freedom. And Lewis says corruption starts in private corporations. No, my friend, corruption starts and ends with government. Corruption starts and ends with a gun. Corporations, private corporations, are the least corrupt. What is truly corrupt are politicians who leverage the fact that they have a gun pointed at the corporation in order to blackmail them to get the money from them. The corruption always starts with the gun, and the gun is only held by the government. Corporations don't have guns. So paperback or ebook, up to you. There's no principle here. There's no one way of doing things. He says private corporations bribing politicians like Microsoft. Exactly the opposite, right? Microsoft used to not bribe politicians at all. I've told this story many times. And politicians told Microsoft that if you want to get into trouble, don't bribe us. And so Microsoft didn't. They didn't bribe them at all. And then government went after Microsoft with antitrust laws and almost broke Microsoft up and destroyed the company for many years. And Microsoft learned the lesson. They played the game. They started bribing the politicians. The corruption always starts with the politician and giving politicians power over the market. Giving politicians power over. The only reason Elias Sanchez has power over Rosero is because Rosero have power over the business. If politicians stayed out of the business of business, business would leave them alone. I read Puerto Rican news. I live in Puerto Rico. So I agree with you. Puerto Rico's corrupt, but the corruption starts and ends with government. And the bigger the government, the more intrusive the government, like the Puerto Rican government is big and intrusive. A third of all people in Puerto Rico work for the government. Now that's horrific. It should be 5% or less. 33%. A government like that is going to be corrupt. By definition, it's going to be corrupt. It's too intrusive. It's too involved. It's too interfering. And business will try to defend itself by leveraging its resources, which is money. Of course, lobbyists are paying because the government is doing things it shouldn't be doing. Okay, let's keep going. Did you hear about companies in China using slaves? No. I've heard companies in China using prison labor, but I don't know about slavery in China. You'd have to be more specific in what you mean by slaves, but I don't know about slaves in China. I mean, China is doing, primarily, the government is doing horrible, horrible things, but slavery, that I've not heard of. Can you please explain the problem with NAP? I just did. The NAP is, and I've done this on many shows, the NAP, the non-aggression principle that libertarians love so much, comes out of nowhere. Has no moral or philosophical foundation. It's just, you shouldn't aggress against other people. And the obvious question to that is why? If I can help you become more moral by forcing you not to take the drugs, by forcing you to behave in particular ways that I believe are moral, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to force people to behave in a way that is good for society, that is good for them even, as an individual? Drugs are bad for you, so we're banning drugs and using force to ban them. Why is that wrong? The libertarians, the non-aggression principle tells you nothing about why that's wrong. You can come up with some kind of utilitarian idea that, yes, maybe in this particular area, the force is going to do harm, but if you ban force completely, then there's some utility function that gets maximized. But it's bullshit. Nobody believes it, and it's just not true. So one has to have a theory about why freedom is good. One has to have a theory about why force is evil, why coercion is evil, why authority is evil. In principle. And that theory has to be connected to the proper way of human living. It has to be connected to the purpose of human life. It has to be connected to the reason, by which human beings live. So force is evil. But there's a reason why it's evil. It's evil because it obstructs the ability of human beings to use their mind in pursuit of their happiness. Whatever the color of their skin is, whatever ethnic background they are, force is wrong because it restricts their freedom to pursue their happiness using their mind. But you have to have a theory of mind. And you have to have a theory about happiness in order to make a statement like that. And libertarians don't. They start with this non-aggression principle, assume it's self-evident, but it's not self-evident at all. Do you really not find any aesthetic value in classical cathedrals? They do have a certain majesty. Yes, they have a majesty, but then when you think about the purpose of their majesty, the purpose of the majesty is to make you feel small. You feel little. In the face of what? In the face of God. But God didn't build the cathedral, human beings did. And yet, the whole point of the cathedral is to make you small. and to elevate the Pope, the priest, the Attila, and the witch doctor above you, who are representatives of God. So yes, I can see a certain aesthetic value in them. Yes, I can see the architectural value, and I can see the purpose, but the purpose is horrific. And what a waste of space. What a waste of labor. And then I think of the crushing work that it took to build these things, of the taxes, and of the labor, taxing poor people because there was no wealth, nobody had wealth, and using poor laborers as slaves in order to do this. It just horrifies me. So I go in, I appreciate the majesty, I remember how this was built, and I'm horrified. So I can only gain a certain amount of pleasure, of aesthetic pleasure out of these cathedrals because of what they represent and how they make me feel inside of them. I don't want to feel small. I'm not small. All right, last three questions. How is Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers integrated into capitalism? Well, it makes capitalism possible because the purpose of the separation of powers is to restrict government's ability to intervene in our lives, to restrict government's ability to make it as hard as possible for consensus to emerge among government to use force against us. So it slows down the process at least. It gives people more time to think about, more time to disagree, more time to stop. Laws that would intervene in our lives. And therefore, separation of powers, I think, is an integral part of freedom, of leaving us free, of protecting our own, of not violating our rights, of not backtracking on a constitution, or not backtracking on freedom. It's not enough, far from enough, but it's essential from a structural perspective, which is important. In your debate at Clemson, fear of change became a topic. World has been changing rapidly for 100 years. Why is stagnation seen as the norm and romanticized? Well, because it has been changing for more than 100 years, 200 years maybe. And I think what people romanticize is an even more distant past. They romanticize the Dark Ages. They romanticize peasant life. They romanticize, I don't know, communal life, a life of a community, as if, you know, of extended families living together. Or they romanticize hunter-gatherers living in tribes because they are anxious. They are people today are lacking in meaning, are lacking in spiritual values, are lacking in understanding of how to live because we don't teach it. We don't embrace, we don't educate properly. We don't teach about character. We don't teach about art. We don't teach about living, about using your reason to guide your life. And as a consequence, people feel alienated. They feel they've got this material wealth, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to live. They don't know what to live for. They're afraid to live for themselves. That's selfish. It's bad, they're told. So they long for a feeling of warmth. Have you ever been in a concert and everybody lights a candle to some slow, beautiful song? And you just feel this, you get this emotional connection with the people around you. And there's a certain calm that comes across everybody. Or if you sing in a group, or if you sing with the band, or whatever, it's just that sense of a lot of people together doing something together provides you with a certain positive emotion. They long for that as a perpetual state of being because they're afraid of being alone, because they've not been taught what to do when they're alone, how to access their reason, how to access their spirit, how to access how to use their consciousness in promoting their own life and making their life more meaningful. And a lot of it is the fact that we don't have good art, that people don't embrace good art, that people don't experience and enjoy great art. And you know, Sullivan and, you know, Poupard, Chopin and Brahms and, you know, the great romantic composer Schumann and Schubert. But that, without that, and I'm telling this to you guys who probably don't listen, some of you who don't listen to this, without that, and without great painting and great sculpture in your life, without really good art, and not just the crap movies that are generated, life becomes poor, it becomes shallow, loses meaning, loses some of its meaning. As I've said often on this show, surround yourself with beauty. Set time aside for beauty, and not for the garbage that sells itself today as beauty. But the real beauty, the universal beauty of classical music, of a Schubert or Chopin or Schumann, embrace that, live that, experience that, dedicate time for it. Then that adds to this. It helps you with that meaning, with that purpose, with the joy, with the happiness. Somebody says, so you'll talk about why philosophers hate Ayn Rand, job security, hating the good for being the good. Objectivism ends any debate for me. True that she never lost the debate. Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. She didn't do debates, so she didn't do many debates as far as I know, so I don't know. And I don't know what losing a debate means, right? Based on whom? I don't think she would ever lose a debate because I think she was right and true. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. I hope you all go and listen to the conversation debate I had with Andrew Sullivan. I think you'd enjoy it. I think you can learn a lot from it. Go read some history. I think the history of these eras is fascinating and interesting. Read that book about Leonardo da Vinci. I recommend it. Continue to follow the show. Support the show, yaronbrookshow.com/support. And, of course, I will be here probably tomorrow. And we are going to talk about Jack Walsh and GE and capitalism and stuff like that. And we will continue fighting for the greatest cause in human history: reason, individualism, the pursuit of happiness. Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.